And so I found with teams, when we break it down in that way, these now become manageable steps. Because what I often hear from coaches is, I can't get her to step up and lead. Well, how big is the step that we're asking them to make? Can we make those steps smaller so they can navigate those a little bit more successfully?
Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will give you practical ideas and strategies that you can apply in your coaching to develop high-performing teams and high-character people. Coaches, I'm excited to welcome Molly Grisham to the podcast. Molly spent 18 years coaching at the collegiate level and now helps teams and organizations build cohesion, develop leaders, resolve conflict, and more. In this episode, we talk about developing leaders, self, peer, and positional leadership, and how to lead your coaching staff well. Like always, if you enjoy this episode and want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode. And coaches, we just wrapped up the first annual summer coaching series, and you can get access to the video replays, audio replays, coaching notes, and more from all 12 sessions of the summer coaching series at summercoachingseries.com. You can also check out the incredible lineup of guests we had and hear what other coaches said about their experience at summercoachingseries.com. And one note about this episode before we hop in. This conversation was recorded live at a coaching convention, so there may be a bit of background noise at times, but we did our absolute best to edit the audio to bring you the highest quality possible. Now to my conversation with Molly Grisham. Enjoy the episode. Coaches, excited to welcome Molly Grisham to the podcast. Molly, thanks for joining me, and I would love it if you just started off by telling the listeners just a little bit about your coaching background and journey, and then what you currently do and why you do that.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I grew up playing soccer and basketball, but soccer was always my primary sport. So after college, I kind of stumbled into coaching, was asked to help coach a friend's son's team, and I fell in love with it right away. And so I made that progression from club sports to high school sports and then into the college game, and spent a good portion of my career coaching Division II women's soccer. And what I realized on my journey was what I loved the most about coaching was developing my players as people. And so I hit a point 5 years ago where I thought there's got to be more. And I literally walked into my AD's office and quit. And I started my own business. And so I now work with teams and organizations, really any group of people who have to function together. So any type of team all over the country on things like team building and leadership development, conflict resolution, and personality assessments. All the stuff that if you do it well, it's kind of like you have a smooth road in front of you. You can go as far or as fast as you want. But if you do that stuff poorly, it's like speed bump after speed bump after speed bump. And you kind of have two approaches with a speed bump. You can either slow down, which no team likes to do, to slow down and deal with stuff, or you plow through it. And you know what happens. Maybe you don't, but I do. I know what happens when I plow through a speed bump in my car. Damage gets done. And so really helping teams to navigate those things that could slow them down. And for me, I just really believe that healthier teams lead to happier people, and happier people lead to healthier teams. It's so cyclical. And so to be able to show up and help coaches and help leaders develop their people in a way that makes everyone healthier, it's just a better experience for everyone involved.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think one, I applaud you for the courage to walk out and realize that, man, I need to change.
Yeah.
I see this thing that I want to go and invest my time in. I think that's awesome. Let's talk more about that. You know, how do we actually develop leaders on our teams? Why is it so important that we develop leaders on our teams, and how do we do it?
Well, there's certainly a couple directions we could go with that question. One reason that I think it's critical that we're intentional about it is for most young people, whether it's the high school level or the college level, they haven't had leadership really modeled for them. It isn't something that people are really seeing a lot in the public eye. So they're not just naturally seeing that happen and figuring that out. There isn't a lot of curriculum. It's not like they're taking high school courses on leadership development. Every once in a while, a coach will make that investment for them, but they're not taking semester long coaches. And so they're coming into it very blind. And they're trusting that the people that were older than them did it the right way and that they should model that behavior. And any coach can tell you that's not always the case, that it's been modeled appropriately for a young person. So for me, it requires incredible intentionality by a coach. And it also really is important that the coach has clarity around what's the role of a leader on this team? What's the skill set that's necessary for a leader? How do we define leadership on this team? And as I work particularly with my athletic clients, I'm finding that a lot of coaches are saying, I don't even know the answer to that. So how would your players know the answer to that? So it's rewarding for me to work with student athletes and help them develop as leaders and oftentimes have them say, I always thought I was a leader, but now I understand what I'm supposed to be doing, how I'm supposed to be behaving, how we define leadership on this team so that I'm actually helping to move us down the road rather than slowing that process down.
I think that you hit the nail on the head there with just the reality that if we as the coach can't articulate it, we really should not expect it to exist or complain that it doesn't.
Mhm.
I don't have any leaders on this team. Well, yeah, correct. You don't because you don't develop any, right?
Right.
And their sets of skills like you talked about there. So I'd love if you would just share maybe with some of the coaches and teams you've worked with, what what have they said? How have they gone about clearly defining what a leader is here and the skills that we're going to develop in them?
So let's start here. Oftentimes, like you mentioned, I'll get a call from a coach who will say, we have no leaders on this team. We just have nothing. We have no leaders. And then I'll come in, I'll work with the team, and I discover that actually they have a couple of really good leaders. But the problem that team is facing is the rest of the team has zero self-leadership. And so when we're starting kind of at the ground floor with a team of where do we start in terms of leadership, one of those conversations we have to have is what is self-leadership? Why does that matter? Where, if we were to rank all of our players on the team, do we land in terms of self-leadership? Because you can have 2 or 3 phenomenal leaders, but if they're having to drag what feels like a dead weight of 20, 22 other people, it doesn't matter how good they are. Your team has to have a base level of self-leadership. Now, for me, that self-leadership is both self-advocacy and, self-awareness and self-management. So do I know myself? And then do I know how I show up in the world? And what kind of adjustments do I want to make there? I think I would add a layer of self-advocacy, but when I talk about it with teams, it really is that awareness piece and that management piece. And so when I work with college teams, you can imagine a 17 or 18-year-old lacks, for the most part, a lot of self-awareness. So before we say you got to lead the team, it's all on you, you got to be able to lead yourself. And do you have that awareness? And do you have that ability to manage yourself? From there, I encourage teams to think about it kind of in tiers or in levels. So we lead ourselves first. That's that self-leadership component. The next piece for me is what I would call peer leadership. So when we look at a freshman on our team and we think, oh my gosh, she has so much potential. I'm ready to make her the leader as a freshman, which can happen. My first question is, what's their self-leadership like? Great, can we check that box? And then can they lead their peers? Can they lead their equals? On a Thursday night, when all the freshmen are going out and they're potentially going to make a really bad choice, is she able to say, I don't think this is a good decision. Let's pause here. So peer leadership is next. The next step for me then is positional leadership. So if you're a starter in the back four, you might be a sophomore, but you get some seniors, some juniors, some freshmen. If you can lead those people who play the same position as you, that's that next step. And then we progress to team leadership. And so I've found with teams, when we break it down in that way, these now become manageable steps. Because what I often hear from coaches is, I can't get her to step up and lead. Well, how big is the step that we're asking them to make? Can we make those steps smaller so they can navigate those a little bit more successfully?
Totally agree with you on that. I think that's a really helpful framework just to have that peer positional team. And it's like you said, it's less intimidating because, like you said earlier, the reality is Molly may not have ever really seen quality leadership model
Yeah.
her. And to try to ask Molly in the middle of practice when you're frustrated as the coach to step up and be a leader, that's just not a way that anybody's going to build skills that they need.
Mhm.
And so breaking it up into those chunks of, okay, first, can you just lead yourself?
Right.
And then can you lead one other person?
Right.
And I'm curious, when you're working with those coaches or when you come in and you're talking with these teams, what are some strategies and some skills that you are teaching those players about how to lead their peers at that peer level, just beyond self? Now they've gotten to peer level. How do they do that? Because, I mean, I remember as a young person athlete, and even still as an adult, it can be intimidating to try to lead your peers, even if it is just one other person. What are the skills that they need to do that?
Yeah. So the word or the phrase I often use with them is thinking of your leadership as influence. And I often say to teams, if you don't think everyone has influence, let's think back to the last practice. And then I just point to someone randomly in the room. When she showed up in a bad mood, did it affect the rest of the team? And they're all like, yeah, it did. I'm like, yeah, but she's not the leader, right? No. She's not the captain, right? No. Is she a starter? No. Then why did it impact the team? Because you all have influence. And so even at that peer level, we have to think about, okay, if I have influence, how am I choosing to use it? To me, it's this idea that a leader is a person of influence who uses their influence for good. Am I using my influence in a way that's helping my team to move forward? Or am I using my influence for short-term personal gains, me just enjoying the moment, or am I actually using it for good on the team?
Yeah, I think that's an important place to start. Just that awareness, helping them become aware that, hey, the reality is, regardless of what your role is on this team, the amount of minutes you're playing, just because you're a part of this group means you have influence on this group. And when they realize that, hopefully that starts to change things in a positive way. Because, yeah, I think for all of us, there was a point when we realized that it's not like that's not some innate thing that we necessarily know. It's something that we learn and develop, and it can be kind of uncomfortable to realize too. Man, I have influence, and mine's really negative right now.
Yeah.
Uh, and I guess that would be my next question. And how do we support those athletes that are behind in some of these skills or that really struggle, whose influence is not positive, um, the majority of the time with the team? How do we support them and develop them?
Yeah. So aside from telling people that I think leadership is a skill, and I don't think you're just born a leader. I think you develop that skill set. The second piece to that equation for me is that I think leadership is also a choice. And we have to let our players know that we see it that way so that when you choose to do the opposite, we can talk about the choice that you're making. And I think it's really hard because for me, coaching is a form of education. It's an opportunity to mentor and to develop people. And so I do approach it as a teacher, as an educator. But there are some people who are so toxic that we are doing a disservice to the rest of our team if we allow them to continue that behavior. And so I think we have to have really clear boundaries, really clear expectations. We have to model it really well as coaches so that we can say to those players who are toxic, here is how your influence is limiting our team. Here is how your influence is a barrier on this team. Here's how the choices that you're making are harming our team. And if you would like to change those, I will support you on that journey. But if you're not willing to make those changes, I don't know if you can be a part of this team.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. There have to be some boundaries that are drawn, especially the higher levels you go. Um, it's hard. It's
It
hard.
is.
And
It is.
yeah, speaking from experience,
Mhm.
having coached a few athletes in similar situations. It sucks too, because I think, almost every coach
Yeah.
wants to positively impact almost every single athlete.
Mhm.
And so to get to a place where you have to draw a line in the sand,
Mhm.
it's hard because, I don't think I'm alone in this. It's easy then to question yourself, man, what did I do wrong? What
Yeah.
could I have done differently? But at the same time, we have to realize that we are, yes, we have massive influence on these young people, but we're also not their savior, and we can't be their savior.
And we're not the only influence.
Yes. Yeah.
If we're talking about a club sport, maybe we see them 4, 6, 8 hours a week.
Yeah.
What are the influences
Oh, yeah.
that we're trying to negate or trying to rub up against as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's kind of go through those steps that you mentioned. We just talked about peer leadership. Let's talk about positional leadership. I think this is an interesting one, and maybe one that could kind of get applicable for coaches. How would you encourage coaches to develop positional leadership within their team? Is there a system that you recommend coaches use to really make sure this is developed? Are they having one-on-one conversations? Are they selecting these leaders? Is it choice? How does that play out? How do we develop positional leaders, kind of these small group leaders?
So one of the concepts that I often share with teams that I think directly relates to this that might be helpful for the listeners is the idea of a first follower. So to me, when you think about a leader, it often feels like the leader's in the spotlight. Everybody else is in the dark, but the leader's in the spotlight. All eyes are on me. Everyone's looking at me. And I do hear from a lot of young leaders who say, I don't want to be in the spotlight. Like I just want to go score goals, or I want to be the best center back, but I don't want this leadership spotlight. And so when we talk about the first follower, to me, that is someone who has one foot in the spotlight and one foot out. So if you're the leader, if you're in the spotlight, I'm thinking about how can I come along and just help you? How can I be your wing woman in this situation? How can I have your back? How can I be the first person to say, yes, great idea. Let's go. I've got you. I've got your back. We're doing that. And so that's a great way to develop your positional leaders. So, in the sport of soccer, maybe you have a back four, you have 4 defenders. And let's say you have 2 center backs, and maybe one is a really dominant, well-respected leader, but you've got another one that you see lots of potential in. Can we ask that one who has a lot of potential, can you be the first follower of that center back so that when they do step up, when they are vocal, you're the first one to say, yes, correct, good decision, I got your back, let's go. The magic for me happens when those roles reverse. When the upperclassman, the key leader, the dominant person, the one everybody naturally respects, when they choose to be the first follower of the potential leader, that changes everything on a team. Because all of a sudden, you're using your influence as this dominant voice to be someone else's first follower. And that is a choice for sure.
2 things I need to highlight there. First, and I'm sure you've seen it and probably use it, the video of the first follower, like the crazy guy that's dancing. Have you seen this video?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, great video. If you haven't seen the video, go find it. This guy's dancing like a maniac, and everyone's just watching, and then one person goes and joins him, and then everyone ends up doing it. And it's less about the guy that started dancing and more about the first guy that went and danced with him.
Right.
And I think that's really powerful. I think the other piece that is really important as coaches that we need to make sure we do, if we're talking about intentionally developing leaders, is we need to make sure that when someone steps up to lead, we recognize and celebrate it.
Yes.
In front of everybody.
And I would add to that, can we as coaches be intentional about inviting our players into that role?
Yeah.
So I often share this story with teams. I had taken over a program that had historically struggled, and I knew my first year, soccer-wise, we were going to struggle. But could we make everything else good, and the soccer part would come along? And so we were playing an opponent that on paper was a little bit better than us, but at halftime it was 0-0, which to me felt like we got a chance here. This is the moment, right? So we're walking into the locker room, and I decide I'm going to give the greatest halftime speech of my life. This is it. I'm pulling out all the stops. I'm gonna say everything, and every coach knows this. Like, you tuck this stuff away in the back of your minds, and what am I going to say? This is it. So I'm pretty certain as I was talking, I think the lights in the locker room dimmed. I think like movie type music was playing. I think my voice sounded like James Earl Jones. Like it was a magical moment. And I get done with this unbelievable halftime speech and I get nothing from my team. Absolutely not a reaction at all. They just sat and stared at me. And I realized in that moment, it wasn't just that we didn't have great leadership on that team. We didn't have first followers on that team, because what I needed in that moment was a player who would stand up and say, like, Coach, we got you. You're right. Let's go. And run out of the locker room, and the whole team would follow her. Because the reality is I was going back to the bench. So I didn't really need them to follow me there. I needed them to follow a first follower. So I had to be really intentional the next few weeks about looking for moments where I could literally prep a player to be my first follower. So if we lost a weekend game, I might call a player in on Monday or Tuesday and say, like, look, I gotta get on us at practice. Can you have my back on that? And every time they'd say, like, yeah, Coach, what do you need me to do? Well, I just want you to stand next to me. And when I kind of get on our team, can you like nod your head and say you agree? If you agree, if this is true, yeah, Coach, I'll do that. And then to your point, that's the moment I'm patting that player on the back. That's the moment I'm stepping back and creating space for her to step into. So if when things get difficult, we as coaches think, I got to crank it up and I have to lead this team, we're actually doing our team a disservice. We've got to take a step back in those moments and figure out how do we invite our players into that space so that they can lead more effectively.
That's really good. And I really like the example there of essentially prepping them to be the first follower.
Right.
That just makes total sense, but not something that I had thought about previously. The only other piece I was thinking about there with the first follower is to just make sure that, in that role, for example, if we're really focused on Molly taking a step in leadership and Jenny ends up being the first follower, like make sure you celebrate Molly for the leadership step she took, and then go find a time to one-on-one say to Jenny, hey, Jenny, I noticed that you were the first follower. I really appreciate it. And Molly might not recognize it, but I do.
Yeah.
And I recognize that what you did was just as important as what she did. To make sure that that person feels seen and valued, recognized for them taking that step, because it's equally a step, an uncomfortable step to be that first follower as it is to step up and lead.
Yeah, because it's a step, right? From where you were, you're stepping into some new space. So whether you're going from first follower to really a visible leader, or whether you're going from, I can do the peer leadership, but now I got to step into that position. It's a step, and we have to acknowledge that. And I often say to groups and to teams, people repeat the behaviors that get noticed. It's plain and simple. You think back to second grade with that like annoying kid, and the teacher kept saying, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop. What did they do? They kept doing it, because it kept getting noticed. Of course, I'm going to keep doing that. So if we want our teammates, if we want our players to repeat behaviors, we have to celebrate those behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important that we do that. We do it consistently, make a habit of it. Let's go to the next step then, team leadership, right? This is what every coach wants. We've got to go through the steps to get there.
Yeah.
But we're at this step now. We've developed self-leaders, peer leaders, positional leaders. How do we develop team leaders? Those people that we really need to drive the whole group forward.
So one of the most critical things that I think we have to do is we've got to give those people an invitation. Like, hey, you've been doing this for 3 years, and now I really trust you. So the floor is yours. The team is yours. I'm going to be your first follower as the coach. I'm going to have your back. So we've got to invite them into that space. And hopefully we've spent a few years equipping them and preparing them for that. But any sort of criticism, we have to do that behind closed doors. Like it's just got to be a one-on-one conversation. And it's so tempting in the moment when a leader doesn't do what we want them to do, to just let them have it. And what that tells the rest of the team is, you don't want to be a leader on this team because you're going to get called out. And so really having that relationship with a student where you can say, okay, look, I know you're still learning. I'm going to have your back. If you make a mistake, we'll talk about it behind closed doors. But I'm going to have your back in front of the team. But I'm going to help you get better, just like I would in your sport. I want you to be the best, whatever your sport is. I want you to be the best at that. I'm going to help you with that. I want you to be the best leader possible. I'm going to help you with that. But that for me as a coach was where it got really fun, because then we could sit behind closed doors and talk about what worked, what didn't work. What did you hear from your teammates? Okay, you're sensing some tension now. What could that be? How do we have that conversation? And how do I help you as the coach to navigate that? So there is kind of a bouncing back and forth where I'll help lead you and I'll be your first follower. And I'll help lead you and I'll be your first. It's just going back and forth. And when you get, particularly at the college level, somebody that's 22 or 23 years old and get to that space, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great that you highlighted that there, especially about the invitation.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much power just in life, anything. Being invited to
Yes.
something is like it's just really cool.
Yes.
When someone invites you to say, hey, will you come to my house for dinner?
Yeah.
Hey, and then to invite hey, will you step up and be a leader of this team?
Yeah.
I see something in you,
Right.
maybe you don't see in yourself. I think you can be in this role, be valuable here. I don't know anybody that would not want to hear that.
Right.
Oh, shoot, somebody believes in me. Somebody wants me to go up to this next level and be a leader.
Right.
And then the other piece that you said, I think is so important. They won't get it right all the time.
Oh my gosh.
And
right.
that's okay.
Yeah.
And to even say that in that invitation, I'm inviting you to be a leader. I don't expect you to be perfect.
Correct.
And to tell them, when you mess up, here's how we'll handle it.
Right.
We'll talk about it, not in front of the team, after practice, the next day. I think that's so important because, like you said, we don't want to invite someone to be a leader and then it's not actually a safe thing that we invited
Right.
them to.
Right.
Oh, shoot, being a leader here means that you get crapped on
Yes.
for everybody else's stuff. It's
Yes.
not my fault they couldn't lead themselves at all.
Correct.
And you're blaming me for everything here.
Yeah.
I get it that you want me to be a leader, but like I can't control Johnny.
Correct.
I don't have I can try to influence him, but we don't want our athletes to be in a spot where they feel like being a leader is a trap.
Correct.
Almost.
Correct.
That would be a miserable feeling for anybody.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of them, they have come from places where it felt that way. So why would I want to do that again? It was miserable. I got called out for everybody else's choices. I don't want that again.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift a little bit here. So much of what we just talked about as far as developing leaders of your players, it applies to us as coaches too.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be growing in those areas. I'd be really curious though, and I don't know how much of a part of your work it is, but what are some areas that you see room for growth for coaches when it comes to leading their coaching staff?
Yeah.
So assuming that you have multiple coaches that you're working with, how can head coaches get better at leading those coaching staffs?
Yeah, that's a great question. About 2 or 3 months ago, I launched for the first time a college coaches mastermind group. So I've got a dozen of us that meet every other Monday, all college coaches across 3 different divisions and 5 different sports. So we're all bringing different experiences to the conversation. And one of the most common discussion questions that comes up in that mastermind group is, how do I delegate to my assistants? How do I manage my assistants? How do I bring my assistants into the program? How do I hand things over to them? And so I think it is really important that coaches are practicing what we're preaching with our players. We've got to practice that with our coaching staff. And so much like we would do with leaders on a team, we've got to invite our assistant coaches to be a part of that process. We've got to assess what their strengths and weaknesses are, and we've got to walk with them in that journey. And that can be really hard and really exhausting when I am being judged purely on how many games we win. And now I've got to mentor this person. I've got to develop this person. I've got to lead this person. But it is a great practice for us as head coaches to be in, of just leading our coaching staff in a way that we want our players to lead their teammates. But it is a difficult thing to do, particularly if you're in a program where maybe you're getting graduate assistants every 2 years, or there's not a high salary. And so there's a lot of turnover with your coaches of having to start over and lead people again.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk more about what coaches share with you. How do I delegate?
Mm-hmm.
As the leader, how do I empower those that I'm leading on my coaching staff
Yeah.
to make meaningful contributions, to feel like they're valued here and that they're bringing work that matters, not just me as the head coach dictating, controlling everything.
So I think one of the first things that we have to do really well is clarity, that we have to be able to articulate to our staff, here's what I need, and here are what my expectations are for this program. The reality is, if somebody's going to get fired, it's going to be the head coach. And then probably everybody else is going to go with the head coach. So let's do our best not to get the head coach fired, and we can all keep our jobs. But I think really having clarity as a coach, what are your values? What are the ways that you want things done? And not assuming that everybody else can just figure that out from hanging around you. You've got to be able to articulate that. And I think one of the challenges that I'm really hearing from coaches that I work with is, I don't know how to say that in a way that doesn't come across as my ego and it's all about me. But we're not going to have consistency in our program if we're not able to have clarity around that and to really make sure we are all on the same page there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and so important as a leader to be able to communicate clearly your values, your purpose, what you guys are going to be about in that program or on that team. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. Not only the coach to assistant coaches, but then, coach to players. How as the leader, how can we more effectively communicate our values, communicate our vision? And ultimately, the real thing is, how can we ensure that it comes to life,
Mhm.
that it's not just words on a wall or some things we want to happen, that they actually come to life?
So I think when we're talking about culture and like words on the wall, I'm so happy you said that, because a lot of people think that that's how we define culture. What are the 4 words we put on the wall today? And the reality is we have to have conversations around, what does that look like in action? What are the behaviors that show those words for us? So if accountability is one of our core values, what does accountability look like on this team? And then we have to make sure we celebrate when those things happen. Much like we said earlier, people will repeat the behaviors that get celebrated and get noticed. And so when we see that stuff happening, we have to make sure we're celebrating it. But there's one other thing. Let's kind of connect these dots. So I'm a big believer on a team that the most influential class on your team is whatever class is a year older than the class that you're talking about. So for your freshmen, your sophomores have the most influence. For your sophomores, it's the juniors. For the juniors, it's the seniors. And so we often say, like, oh, your senior class is so important. Yes, because they're teaching your juniors, and your juniors are teaching your sophomores, and your sophomores are teaching your freshmen. But the reality is there's a big gap between your freshmen and your seniors in terms of influence. I would say the same of a coaching staff. As much as you want to say, I'm the head coach, I have the most influence, you've got to pass that down to your assistant coaches, who may pass it down to a grad assistant, who then are passing it down to your players. And so we've got to recognize we can't expect freshmen to seniors to have the most influence. In the same way, we can't expect players to head coach to have the tightest amount of influence. We've got to make sure that we pass that down to every stage of adults on our program in a way that they can then pass that down to their players.
Thanks for sharing that, Molly. I think that's really good stuff. Here's my last question for you, and then I'll hit you with a few rapid fire questions.
Okay.
What do you think is the most important leadership behavior for us to exhibit as coaches?
I would love for that answer to be honesty when we make a mistake, honesty when we drop the ball, honesty when we are not at our very best, because I think it has the power to make us human again for our players. And so often, so many of our players look up to us and think, gosh, I could never be like my coach because they've got it all figured out. And those moments when we can say, you know what, we lost that game. And I don't think I prepared you as well as I should have prepared you. And that's on me. I'm going to do better. Or I didn't watch as much film for that game as I normally do. And I think that might have cost us the game. So I'm going to own that. And typically in those moments, if it's a healthy team with healthy culture, we're now going to see players saying, yeah, but I need to own my role too, because honestly, I didn't get enough sleep the night before. I didn't eat healthy that morning, or I didn't do what I was supposed to do. But I think in so many ways, it starts with that honesty and really just allowing our players to see the human side of who we are, because it gives them permission to do the same.
I love that, and I'm glad you shared it. The willingness to be vulnerable, so important. We have to go first as the leader. If you want to create a culture of shared vulnerability where people are really connected, feel safe, they're willing to be honest, and you've got to do that
Right.
first. You got to be willing to admit when you screw up.
Yep.
Uh, that's awesome, and I just like that's so powerful. What an incredible place and space to be able to teach that lesson to the young people we
Yeah.
teach and lead. That hey, being a leader doesn't mean you're infallible,
No.
or or yeah, being a leader doesn't mean you have to be perfect.
Right.
You can. We are all messy.
Yep.
And that's okay.
Yep.
And I'll show you that I'm willing to admit that and grow through that. Molly, this has been awesome. Before we wrap it up, I have 3 quick rapid fire questions for
Okay,
you.
hit me.
You can answer about your coaching experience or
Okay.
about the work you do now. Here's the first one. The most fun part of coaching is
For me, it's what I would call the light bulb moments. It's that moment when something clicks for someone. They see something about themselves. They learn something like, I didn't know I could do that, or I didn't know that was a skill I had, or they see something about a teammate that they haven't noticed before. But when it's a really good light bulb moment, like you can physically see a change in a person, and whether that's coaching on the field or whether that's talking about leadership and culture, that moment where they're not going to be the same, because that moment they see things differently.
yeah, that's fantastic. Love those moments. Here's the next one. I wish I would have known blank before my first coaching experience.
I wish I would have known it was okay to ask for help. And I think that's part of why I made this transition. Is I saw so many coaches in so many industries. We could probably say I saw so many leaders in so many industries who just needed somebody who could come alongside them and say like, yeah, you're good. You're good. I got you. I'm right. I'm right here if you need me, but you're doing really good. Keep going. And there were so many days in my coaching journey where I just needed somebody that I trusted who could have said, yeah, today was hard, but tomorrow's going to be better.
Yeah.
You got this. I got your back. Let's go.
Yeah, that's really good. Here's the last one. I know I'm successful as a coach when
When I feel like I have a healthy relationship with the people I'm leading.
Yeah.
I don't think there was any greater honor as a college coach than when a player would come in and say, can you write me a letter of recommendation for grad school?
Yeah.
Can you write me a letter of recommendation
Yeah.
for this? Can you help me? What books should I be reading, coach?
Yeah.
What podcast should, when you just have a healthy human to human relationship with the people that you're leading, that to me tells me this is working. You're doing
Yeah.
something right.
Yeah, it's special. I'd add to that, and I guess this is just me personally, it triggered it in my mind. Being told, I'm a teacher. So I had another teacher tell me, hey, I had so and so in my class. He said he really liked playing for you.
Yes. Yes.
It's like, oh, wow. And there's a kid I coached a year or two before. It's like, he said he really enjoyed it. I was
Yeah.
like, wow. Okay. Like that's when you know that
Right.
it's been worth it.
Right.
Well, Molly, this has been awesome. Before we wrap it up, just share with people where they can connect with you and learn more about what you do.
Certainly. My website is my hub. It's mollygrisham.com, Grisham. You can find all my social media there. I have a YouTube channel. About every other week, I drop some short videos. So certainly teams are free to use those as discussion points with their players. Every other week, I email my list what I would call light bulb moments. It's important to me. So if people are looking for little stories and insights about the stuff that I'm learning with teams, I share that with my list. And then all my social handles are there as well. But if there are ways I can support or be a resource or help your listeners in any way, I hope they'll reach out.
Awesome. Thanks a ton, Molly.
Thanks for having me.
Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode, and thanks to Molly for joining me. You can find links to connect with her in the show details. And as always, if you enjoyed the episode and you want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF. My practical takeaway from today's episode is to break your leadership down into smaller steps. Like Molly discussed, coaches are often complaining about players not stepping up to lead, but she asked such an insightful question. How big is the step you're asking them to take? We should be respectful and understanding of the different places each athlete is at on their leadership journey, and then we need to help them identify and take small leadership steps forward. When we're intentional about asking them to take small leadership steps forward, it's not as intimidating for them, and they're going to be more likely to do it and feel successful after they've done it. And Coach, if you enjoyed this episode, would you take a minute to either leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and or give us a shout out on Twitter? It goes a long way towards helping us reach more coaches who can then impact more athletes. And that's what we're all about here. And don't forget to check out summercoachingseries.com to learn more or get access to our 2022 Summer Coaching Series. Thanks for listening to the podcast.